Twickenham Film Studios, January 1969. Paul McCartney arrived before 8 in the morning, earlier than the camera crew, carrying an electric bass and a yellow legal pad with chord progressions written in his narrow, controlled handwriting. The studio was a converted warehouse with cement floors and aluminum roof panels that rattled when wind pushed through gaps in the framework. The heating system had not been installed. John Lennon was not there yet. George Harrison sat near the back wall with his coat still on. Ringo Starr drank tea from a thermos and looked at nothing in particular. Paul had decided weeks earlier that they needed to play live again. "We've been in the studio too long," he told Michael Lindsay Hogg in December. "We need to get back to playing, just the four of us. Raw, like Hamburg." Lindsay Hogg, the director, asked if the others agreed. Paul said, "They will. Once we start, they'll remember why we do this." He had scheduled the filming, arranged the studio, drawn up lists of songs they might attempt. He moved around the cold room, checking microphone placement and asking the crew about camera angles. George did not look up. Ringo nodded occasionally. John was 40 minutes late. When Lennon finally walked in with Yoko Ono, he said almost nothing. She sat directly beside him on a cushion next to the amplifier. Paul suggested they start with something simple. "Let's try one of the rock and roll numbers, something we all know. Get the blood moving." John tuned his guitar without responding. Paul tried again, speaking louder this time, addressing the room rather than John specifically. "Let's just get something down, doesn't matter what. Just play." John looked at him briefly. "I don't feel like forcing it," he said. Paul's face stayed neutral, but his jaw tightened. He turned to George. "What do you think?" George said. "I don't care either way." They began attempting a song Paul had brought in. The tempo kept collapsing. John played sparsely, leaving long silences where he used to fill space with rhythm. Paul stopped and started the band repeatedly, calling out instructions. "Keep it tight. Watch the tempo. Come in on the second beat." John asked if they could take a break. They had been playing for less than an hour. Paul said they had just started. John said he was tired. Paul reminded him they had a deadline. "We've got cameras running. We've got people waiting." John shrugged and put his guitar down and walked to the far corner with Yoko. Paul stood alone near the microphone, holding his bass, watching them talk quietly with their backs turned. Michael Lindsay Hogg later described the atmosphere. Paul was working very hard to keep it together. He'd suggest things, arrange things, and the others would sort of go along with it or not. John was... he was elsewhere. He was physically there, but he wasn't present, if you know what I mean. Glyn Johns, the engineer, said, "Paul was the only one trying. George was pissed off. Ringo looked uncomfortable, and John was just... he'd show up and sit there with Yoko, and you could tell he didn't want to be there at all." The previous summer had been different. At Abbey Road, they had still functioned as a unit, even when the arguments started. In June of 1968, after they returned from India, John had brought Yoko into the studio for the first time. Paul said nothing directly, but Jeff Emmerich, the engineer, recalled, "You could see Paul wasn't happy about it. He kept himself busy, kept moving around, but he was aware of her the whole time." They all were. George Martin said later, the moment Yoko came in, the dynamic changed. It wasn't just that she was there. It was that John insisted she be there, right beside him, for everything. It broke an unspoken rule. Paul worked harder during the White Album sessions than George Martin had ever seen. "He'd stay after everyone else left," Martin said, overdubbing bass lines, doing vocal harmonies by himself. "I think he thought if he worked hard enough, it would pull them all back together." Paul told Ray Coleman of Disc and Music Echo in September 1968. "We're in great shape, exploring new territory. The new album is going to be incredible. Totally different from anything we've done." Coleman noted in his article that Paul answered most of the questions while John sat silently and left before the interview finished. By autumn, the fracture had calcified. John stopped attending sessions for songs he had not written. When Paul suggested arrangements, John dismissed them or agreed in a tone that made his indifference clear. Paul would say, "What about trying it this way?" And John would just say, "Yeah, fine, whatever you want," Emmerich recalled. It was worse than arguing. At least when they argued, they cared. Paul responded by working faster, arriving earlier, preparing more material. In late September, George Harrison brought in something, and Paul immediately began suggesting chord changes. "Paul started telling me how to play it," George said in a 1977 interview. "I told him to let me finish it my own way. He backed off, but then the next day he came back with the same suggestions. So I just recorded it without him. The fracture was not clean. There were still hours when they played well together, but those hours became isolated incidents. John began recording his own songs quickly and moving on. Paul began insisting they take more time. John would say, "That's good enough, let's move on," Martin recalled. And Paul would say, "We need another take. We can get it better." John would say, "I don't want to overthink it." Paul would say, "We owe it to the audience to do it properly." And John said, "I remember this clearly. Since when do you speak for the audience?" At Twickenham in January, the question of what they owed anyone became unavoidable. Paul had organized the entire project around the idea of public performance. He had told Lindsay Hogg, "The Beatles need to reconnect with the physical act of playing. We've been too insulated." He had not consulted the others before confirming the schedule. When George asked why they were filming at all, Paul said, "It'll be good for morale. Give us something to aim for." George said, "I don't see how cameras improve morale." Paul said, "It'll give us a reason to focus." George said, "If we need cameras to focus, we've got bigger problems." John did not argue. He simply withdrew. John would show up late, or not at all, Ringo said in Anthology. When he was there, he'd play a bit and then just sit there. You could tell his mind was somewhere else. Yoko remained beside him, a silent physical fact that altered the geometry of every interaction. Paul never asked her to leave. "I knew if I said anything about Yoko, that would be it," Paul said in 1984. "John would have walked out and never come back, so I tried to work around it." He directed all his comments to John, who increasingly did not respond. On January 10th, George Harrison walked out. He left quietly in the middle of the afternoon after a tense exchange with Paul about how to play a guitar line. The film cameras captured most of it. Paul demonstrated what he wanted on his bass. George said he would play it his own way. Paul said, "It needs to fit the arrangement." George said, "I'm tired of being told what to do by you." Paul said, "I'm trying to make it work as a song." George said, "Then you play the guitar parts?" He put down his instrument and said, "See you around the clubs," and walked out of the building. Paul's immediate response, caught on film, was to suggest they continue as a three-piece. "We can get Clapton in, or we just do it ourselves." He said it brightly, almost as a joke, though his face showed no humor. John said nothing. Ringo looked at the floor. Paul picked up a guitar and started playing. John eventually joined in, but the session ended within an hour. That night, Paul called George and apologized. "I rang him up and said, 'Look, I'm sorry, come back,'" Paul recalled in Anthology. "I didn't really know what I was apologizing for, to be honest. For being pushy, for trying to make things work, but I wanted him back." George agreed to return after several days. The concession was that they would move out of Twickenham, abandon the live performance plan, and return to Apple's basement studio. George's terms were no more filming at Twickenham, no big concert, Lindsay Hogg said. Paul agreed to everything. The cameras kept rolling. Paul continued to lead the sessions, but his authority had become a kind of performance. He announced takes, counted off tempos, made production decisions. John let him. John would just sit there and let Paul run everything. Glyn, Johns recalled. If Paul asked his opinion, John would say, "Whatever you think is fine." If Paul pushed for a real answer, John would say, "I'm not that invested." One time Paul said, "Well, what are you invested in then?" And John said, "I don't know yet." You could see it just killed Paul. The question of Yoko was never directly addressed. "I didn't blame Yoko," Paul said in a 1984 Playboy interview. "She was just there. John made her presence non-negotiable. The problem wasn't her specifically. It was that John had imported a separate life into a space that had always been shared." George was more blunt in a 1970 interview with Rolling Stone. Yoko's constant presence was a statement John was making about where his priorities were. None of us could pretend otherwise. Ringo said in 2000, "It was uncomfortable, but I understood it. John needed something we couldn't give him, but it destroyed the way we worked. The four of us had always been alone together. That privacy was gone." Paul's public statements at the time insisted everything was fine. In a BBC radio interview in February 1969, he said, "The new album's going to be raw and honest, back to our roots. We're all really excited about it." The interviewer asked if there was tension in the group. Paul laughed. "There's always tension. That's how we push each other. That's how we've always worked." He did not mention that George had quit, or that John was barely speaking to him, or that he himself was showing up to sessions with fully arranged songs that required the others only as instrumentalists. The album that emerged from those sessions was shelved for over a year. "None of us could stand to listen to it," Ringo said. "It was too painful. You could hear how unhappy we were." Phil Spector was brought in later to salvage the recordings. He added orchestration and choirs. When Paul finally heard the results, he was horrified. "He tried to block the release," George Martin said. "He felt Spector had ruined his work, but by then he didn't have the power to stop it." John told Rolling Stone in 1970, "I like what Spector did. It covers up how joyless the original sessions were." Paul told Melody Maker the same year, "Spector ruined the album. He took beautiful, simple songs and covered them in syrup." Neither of them mentioned that the original recordings were documents of a group that had stopped functioning. By the summer of 1969, they attempted one more album. Abbey Road was recorded quickly and professionally. "We worked like session musicians," George Martin said. "Each of them on their own material, contributing parts to the other's songs, but not as a band. Not anymore." Paul wrote the medley that closed the album, a suite of song fragments stitched together with meticulous overdubs. John brought in "Come Together" and "I Want You, She's So Heavy," both recorded in a handful of takes. George contributed 2 songs. Ringo played efficiently and left immediately after his parts were finished. "It was the saddest project I ever produced," Martin said. "They were all talented and polite and completely disconnected." Jeff Emerick described Paul's energy during those sessions as manic. He worked insane hours, tracked multiple instruments himself, pushed for perfection on every mix. I think he believed that if the album was good enough, it would repair something. He also knew it wouldn't, but he kept working anyway because stopping would mean admitting it was over. On September 20th, 1969, during a business meeting at Apple, John Lennon told the others he wanted a divorce from the band. "I said, I want a divorce," John recalled in his 1970 Rolling Stone interview. "Like a divorce. I said it casually because I'd been thinking about it for months. It wasn't a big dramatic moment for me. It was just the truth." Paul, according to Peter Brown, who was present, went quiet. Paul asked if he was serious. Brown said. John said he'd never been more serious. Paul asked if it was because of Yoko. John said it wasn't about Yoko. It was about him being done with being a Beatle. I asked what we were supposed to do with the album we'd just finished. Paul said in 1984. John said release it and move on. I asked if we could talk about it privately. John said there was nothing to talk about. George said, If John's out, I'm probably out too. Ringo said nothing. I looked at John for a long time, Paul recalled. Then I said we should wait. We shouldn't make any public announcements. We should think about it. John agreed not to tell the press, and I immediately started planning another album because I couldn't accept that it was over. The agreement to stay silent lasted 4 months. In that time, Paul recorded his first solo album in secret. I made it because I needed to prove I could work alone, he told Life magazine in 1971. That I wasn't dependent on the group or on John. I also made it because I was terrified. The band had been the structure of my adult life. I had no idea who I was without it. In April 1970, Paul McCartney released a self-interview with his solo album in which he stated he had no plans to work with John Lennon again, that the Beatles were effectively over, and that he was happier now. The press treated it as the official announcement. John was furious. Paul didn't quit, John told Melody Maker in May 1970. I quit in September. He's making it look like he's the one who left, like he's the victim. It's a fiction designed to make himself look good. Paul did not respond publicly. I was devastated, he said in 1984. Not just that the band was over, but that John saw it as a competition. Who quit first? Who controlled the narrative? It wasn't a competition to me. It was a tragedy. The legal battles that followed lasted years. Paul sued the other three to dissolve the partnership. John, George, and Ringo opposed the suit. Depositions were filed. It got ugly, Ringo said. We said things in court we never should have said, things we couldn't take back. The court dissolved the partnership in 1975. By then, they had not been in the same room in 5 years. Paul said in September 1980, in an interview with Musician magazine, I still don't fully understand what happened. One day we were a band. The next day, John had gone somewhere I couldn't follow. I blame myself for trying to hold it together by force, for not recognizing that John needed to leave, for making his departure feel like betrayal instead of evolution. I also blame John for shutting me out, for deciding unilaterally that we were finished, for choosing Yoko over a partnership that had created everything we both were. The interview was published after John was murdered on December 8, 1980. Paul has rarely spoken about any of it since. Twickenham Film Studios, January 1969. Paul McCartney stood near a microphone with a bass guitar he had been holding for 20 minutes without playing. John Lennon and Yoko Ono sat in the corner talking quietly. George Harrison had his coat on. Ringo Starr drank cold tea and waited. Paul looked at the crew and asked if they were ready to try another take. The director said they were ready whenever the band was. Paul asked the band if they were ready. No one answered. Paul counted off a tempo. They began to play. The song fell apart after 2 minutes. Paul stopped them. Let's try it again, he said. They tried again. It fell apart sooner.